Welcome to the Laps Fancast. I'm Fro.
I'm Celes.
And we're your co-hosts on this, our review of the 2018 spring season slate of anime. It was pretty heady and fairly, just a lot of shows. That's the way I put it.
We disagreed on a lot of shows this season.
Yeah, for sure. And if you folks out there are a frequent listener of the show, you'll know that we did a similar kind of seasonal recap episode way back. I want to say it was our second episode of the show, and it was a 2-hour long program. So if you're tuning into this episode, we'll try to also remember to let you guys know what we're doing for the other parts of this. We're actually going to break up our review of the spring season episodes into pairings that we thought...
There's just too many episodes to talk about.
And it was just going to be conducive for our normal recording session. So we decided to do things differently. We also kind of wanted to see how this would be received as well by you guys, and to see if maybe even, you want to hear us cover a smaller number of shows in greater depth in the future. And as always, if you do want to let us know how we're doing, or if you have any thoughts or questions about the show, just hit us up via email at lapsedfancast@gmail.com. Pretty much the format for the seasonal review episodes we usually do is we're going to give you a general synopsis of the show. Then we're going to talk about, just our feelings about the anime, what we thought worked, what we thought didn't work, characters and ideas we liked, and anything else we felt particularly strongly about the show. Yeah. And while Celes and I might not have watched each show to completion, at this point we've hopefully watched enough of every show we're going to talk about today, or at least, both of us have given each show a shot to some degree.
Yeah.
And, we'll be talking about them over the next few episodes of the podcast. As always, other piece of business to take care of. Want to always make sure to thank Quinn for our intro and outro music. And with that,
thanks, Quinn.
Yeah, with that, as always, the other important thing is that we are going to delve into spoilers for almost all the shows we're going to talk about, just because it's a lot more interesting that way. So if you're not interested in, or if you have not watched a number of the shows that we are covering this seasonal review, make sure to go check them out before coming back to us. As always, I'll make sure to indicate which shows we'll be covering in each episode. So no worries about getting spoiled that way. We're not going to trick you guys or anything. And so with that, I'm going to switch over to the first show we're going to take care of from this season, and that is Megalobox. Megalobox was commissioned to celebrate the 50th anniversary of legendary boxing manga and anime Ashito no Joe. It is the story of Junt Dog, a young drifter by day and boxer by night, who doesn't even know his name, and Nanbu, the eye patch wearing, sly, underhanded trainer who strikes up a partnership with Junt Dog to throw some matches in underground illegal fights using fitted metal augmentations on their torsos, shoulders, and arms called gear. The world of Megalobox and this Megaloboxing is especially cruel to those on the fringes of society, like Junt Dog and Nanbu, and their lifestyle, their particular style of Megaloboxing in a dystopian post-war world is all the pair know, despite Junt Dog making it clear that he wants more. That all changes one day when Junt Dog nearly crashes his motorcycle into Yukiko Shirato, the head of the uber-wealthy Shirato Group and organizer of the newly created Megalonia Megaloboxing tournament. In doing so, he picks a fight with top-ranked boxer and Shirato Group representative Yuri, who comes to collect not long after in the underground. Though Yuri dominates him in their unsanctioned fight, Junt Dog doesn't stay down too long after the count, which amuses the champ. He tells Junt Dog to meet him in the ring at Megalonia. Through Nanbu's mob connections, Junt Dog is able to secure entry into the tournament, as well as citizenship, permitting him to make a name for himself both figuratively and literally. So Junt Dog, inspired by a billboard he passed by, takes the name of Joe, thereby linking this futuristic take on boxing with the lineage of Ashita no Joe. With 3 months until the start of Megalonia, it's up to Joe, Nanbu, and their little buddy Sachio to challenge the world and earn their chance to fight amongst the best Megaloboxers in the world. But with Joe's gear broken in the aftermath of his fight with Yuri, what chance does this underdog have at succeeding? A 13-episode anime original, though again with clearly inspired source material from the Ashita no Joe series by Studio TMS Entertainment, who are responsible for a ton of series, but including D. Gray Man, Real Life, Orange, Steel Teaser Takagi-san, and Yowamushi Pedal. Megalobox has been described by many as the most hyped show of the season, which is no small feat considering it shares a core with My Hero Academia. With that, what did you think of Megalobox, Celes?
It's lackluster at best.
Let's start with some positives.
Oh yeah, sure. There are a couple of really good fights. The visual aesthetic, except for the visual aesthetic, is like beautiful. The environmental designers did a really out of this world job on the show. It's kind of weird because they're trying to capture this like old style, like 90s aesthetic for the show, and it's just like it feels off a lot of the times. It feels strange.
I definitely want to get into the details about that strangeness because I basically agree. I would say that I pretty much agree. I feel like the show, if I was to come down harshly, I would say that it's pretty much half-assed. But if I was going to be a bit more lenient, I would say there were some pretty questionable decisions in hindsight. But if I was going to highlight the best points of the show, as Celes alluded to, the environmental and the background art is stunning. Although it's
amazing,
but it's ultimately kind of wasted. And we'll get that.
It's kind of weird because the backgrounds all look hand painted, but the characters are obviously digitally scaled down.
And there's more about the digital scaling that I'll get to in a second. But the use of mixed media in the art is inspiring. I mentioned in the synopsis that Joe is driving by on his bike and he sees this giant billboard that has it references an ordinary Joe in the advertisement, and the way that scene is shot is really striking visually, and it's a perfect example of mixed media, as well as really good CG. And like you definitely see the good CG, especially in the intro, and in particular kind of like they deploy it really well when they're entering the Megalonia arena or any of the boxing arenas where the fights take place. And I would say that the character designs, which I think is what people are really talking about when they're talking about how the show is a throwback to 90s anime like Cowboy Bebop and Trigun, are actually really cool. They have like really simple colors and very simple elements to them that are really appealing. Joe is a character design that's ripe for cosplaying. Basically, it's pretty cool. And I would actually say that the voice acting from the Japanese voice acting cast is also really good. Sometimes I would say, in my opinion, sports anime requires some specific voices. It's almost kind of like how you look for very specific voices in shonen battle manga. It's a very similar kind of thing. And I felt like all the like B movie beats for voices was there. Like everything sounded like legit. Nobody sounded out of place.
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
Yeah.
Before we go on talking about this show, I'll just preface by saying I technically haven't finished this show. I watched 9 out of 14 episodes, or 9 out of 13 episodes. And I also want to just make it clear that I don't have any I don't have a background in visual design or graphic design or anything along that. I'm just kind of going off my gut feeling when I'm talking about the visual aesthetic in this show. So if I make myself out to be a fool because of some technical details, I apologize in advance and am happy to be called out on my nonsense.
Yeah, I mean we're two anime fans that neither of us have any kind of professional kind of training or any kind of classical training and analysis as is. It's just like we wanted to be a part of the conversation, and we think the world is ripe for voices like ours. And so, to that point, I would say that I think the visual issues with Megalobox, you don't need to have a couple of like credits from USC's film school to understand that there's something off. And basically, I'll get back into some of the things I liked about the show, but since we are we're pretty much like hemming towards criticism, I'll talk about this. So for one, the fight choreography in the show is wonky. There are, I want to say, Joe participates in 7 fights. The fight with Yuri is the initial one is good. He has this weird, like, I mean, it's technically a fight, but it's like a street brawl. That's fine. But the first fight where we've already established the premise, and like, John Dog is now Joe and Joe forever for the rest of the series, is Joe against this boxer named Samajima, who's basically shark themed, and the animal themes are a big part of the show too. So I'll get to that in a minute. And in this fight, there are just some decisions in terms of how to animate the action, in particular Joe staggering around the ring, that just don't look right, or like they look like they were rushed. And in some of the other fights, especially later on down the line, veer into like one-shot territory where we're like fast forwarded through several rounds of action, and that's just, it feels super cheap in a sense, especially for a boxing anime. And boxing anime, you're in the lineage of stuff like Hajime no Ippo. Exactly. And it's like
the original actual Ashita no Joe.
Yeah, and I mean, I understand that a lot of those decisions were in order to fit more story into the proceedings, but
the story's so bland.
I was gonna say, like, you should
be telling like small scale character stories with each of these fights, like the Aragaki fight, which I think is the one he fights after Samajima.
Yes,
is a really standout fight.
Yeah, if we're going to say, like, the most positive thing we would say about the show is that episodes 5 and 6, which deal with Joe, after he defeats Samajima, he's starting to get attention for fighting all of these folks using gear in Megaloboxing without gear, by the way. He starts getting attention and starts gaining the nickname Gearless Joe. His next fight is like this really deeply personal fight with a ex-military amputee named Aragaki, who, unlike a lot of the other boxers with animal themes, his is a lot more subtle in the form of a blue butterfly, which is really cool. It's not like all the other animal motifs are like vicious animals for the most part, and his is a butterfly, which is really cool. It's a cool contrast. And the two-parter is just really good. What were your thoughts about that? The two-parter, Celes?
I loved it. I loved everything about the Aragaki fight. The build-up, like building the tension between Nanbu and Aragaki, and like seeing how Junk Dog fits into all of that, which is weird because Nanbu was like deeply emotionally impacted by this fight happening, with the premise being that he basically abandoned Aragaki once he left for the military. He had to ship off to war. And when he came back, Nanbu's gym was closed, and he felt like his home had been lost. But Joe is just like, I just want to fight, which is kind of interesting, because it makes the whole fight about Nanbu and Aragaki. Like, you can kind of say that Joe's the stand-in, but as the fight like kind of continues, you find that Joe is not a stand-in for Nanbu. Aragaki is never going to deal with his issues, his like emotional trauma, just by fighting Joe. He's not going to get to Nanbu through Joe, if that makes sense, Like
that's a good angle. I've never thought about it that way, but good point.
Like the whole fight is not Aragaki like trying to. He's trying to inflict pain on Nanbu. He's trying to like show Nanbu like you chose wrong. You should have stuck with me. Like I was your guy. And
when in reality it was a big misunderstanding too in terms of
it was
because
that's kind of the tragedy about it.
Yeah, because Aragaki was reported as dead.
He was because of what happened to him in the war, and he kind of crawled himself back.
Yeah, exactly. And the fight has probably the best fight choreography, the best.
Oh, it's wonderful.
It has the best like sensible there's a lot that goes into like Joe having to make sure that he adjusts his style to account for Aragaki's strengths. And the ending is it's probably the most impactful ending of all of Joe's fights, which is
like I said earlier, I didn't finish the anime, but of all the fights I saw, nothing could even hold a candlestick up to the Aragaki fight.
No, and that is more of a this is me praising that fight in the fight direction, and I'm really hoping that like there was some very specific talent that worked on those episodes that I can look forward to doing more stuff in the future, because man, it felt like they abandoned them as soon as that two-parter was done.
One thing I think is really interesting about the Aragaki fight, since we're talking about it, is I feel like this is one of the only fights where they really utilize the strengths of gear. Like, in all the fights leading up to that, it feels like gear is just a way to have people hit harder. And then you get to the Aragaki fight, and here's someone who's using gear he uses gear to let him stand, because he's lost both of his legs. And the way he uses his gear is primarily to give him extra spring, so he can spring into his punches. Like, that's like a definite advantage, when you're boxing, and being able to like put a little bit extra force than your opponent might be like thinking about. It lets him like his whole motif is the butterfly, kind of like the saying goes, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Yeah.
And the way he uses his gear like really complements that theme. The way he's springing about, almost floating around the ring. I think it's shown off really well. And it's a shame that the very next fight that Joe gets into, which is with the AI guy, I think.
Yeah, it's with Mikio.
Yeah, Mikio.
I mean, that one is actually about the use of gear, because it's
about the use of gear, but it's showing. I'm trying to draw a comparison here, because Aragaki fight shows gear used as a tactical advantage. It's there to cover a person's weaknesses. It's used really smartly. Mikio uses his gear to just do his fighting for him. And it becomes his greatest weakness. And like that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. But
the show does...
It's just really dull.
The show does do enough to like... Because from that, it almost seems as though like Mikio's entire fighting capacity is just from the AI-driven gear that he has. But in reality, he's a tough son of a bitch, and he's like down.
Is he though?
He is.
He goes down in a single hit.
I know. Like they take pains to try and establish like even Nambu's like he's not really avoiding you. He just knows he can. I mean, again, I'm gonna give Mikio credit here for actually acting like an anime villain and like withholding something we want. Because as the audience, as kind of implausible as Joe's rise to getting an entry spot in the most exclusive worldwide boxing tournament is, we still do want to see him fight. And so, like, that little poll is actually like, it's like, yeah, no, he legitimately acted villainously, which is good, because you need villains to act villainously, especially when the main rival is a rival of honor, which is dope. I want, if you don't mind, can we pivot to talking about Yuri?
Yeah, that's fine.
So, Yuri's a badass.
He really is. His motif is like a wolf.
And not only is his motif a wolf, but if you're like really down for like anime OSTs, his theme, which I forget what the name is, it's like this really badass synth heavy leitmotif that plays whenever he and his crazy ass presence. Like there's like a good sports anime will give characters, especially rivals and opponents, presence when they show up on screen, and every time Yuri's on screen, it's like everything's about him, and which is great because I like that. You want your villains to actually have presence. Like contrasting him with Mikio, who like turns up as like a Rule 63 version of the boss. I'm sorry, he looks so similar to his sister. I mean, like that makes sense, but like it's like he shows up like episode. He shows like I think he shows up in episode 6, and you're just like, oh, this person's important, and they finally do manage to establish him as being important. But it's very much like I think you could have like done something with this before this episode, especially because they're trying to establish the whole AI arms race subplot thing throughout the entire show, and they do a really bad job of it.
They do a terrible job of it.
Yeah, the world building in Megalobox is not particularly great. I mean, we get some information about...
Well, I'll say that aspects of it are good and aspects of it are really bad. It's just that you don't notice the aspects that are good. You remember when I said that the environmental artists were like, they did a wonderful job?
Yes.
So all of the work that they went into painting the atmosphere and like all the cityscapes and the grungy back alleys and showing this like dirty kind of like rundown city with its like flickering billboards and broken down shops and corrupt cops, and like all of this is world building, and it's sold extremely well, I think, just through the power of the atmosphere
and the music and the soundtrack too.
Yeah, the soundtrack too. I think that aspect, you don't even notice how good it is. Even more on that, I think that like showing the contrast between the high-risers part of the city and the part of the city where Joe and Nanbu train, it's amazing.
Yeah, they train in a van down by the river. Not in a van, but down by the river for sure.
They're under a fucking bridge, and it's just like this dusty, like, obviously they're in the ghetto. But then you go to a Shirato scene, and there's all these lights, and everything is clean, and it's obviously the same city. But it's, like, totally different, and you can just tell that there is a lot of economic disparity in this city. But where they fail in the world building is super obvious, because they're just like, hey, here's a detail, accept it. We're not going to, like, give you any build up to it. It's just, and this is what we're basing the entire plot on. Go for it. And
yeah.
Like,
yeah.
But why?
I don't know. There's also like there's one small little subplot that has to deal with Sachio's parentage and like, or not his parentage, like what happened to his dad that has to do with the Shirato company, and it's like more or less like used in conjunction with like he runs away from the fight, but then he comes back to give Joe like the cheer and support he needs kind of thing, which is fine. This is a boxing show. Like that is a tried and true standard of boxing and other combat sports. I'm totally fine with that. It's less so that they went that route and more so that it doesn't really do much beyond that. And I guess fine. It's everything is more or less in service of Joe's rise through the tournament, so you kind of have to like acknowledge that that's the lens we're supposed to be directed through as the audience. But there's so much about the rest of the world that's so appealing because, again, I want to make this clear. Celes and I are actually fans of aspects of the visual aesthetic of the show, and that they inform us about a larger world, and that shit is immersive, and we want to be immersed in this kind of show. But if you don't mind, we have to talk about the resampling issue. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Let's talk about it.
So I was really excited for this show when I saw it was first announced. I'm a big Hajime no Ippo fan. And I was like, oh, yeah, we definitely need some more. We haven't had a good modern boxing anime since for a while. And so I was like, I'm willing to buy into this original series, even if it's, like, it'll be pretty fine. I can see it having, like, a ceiling of, like, an 8 kind of show where I'm like, yeah, this is really enjoyable and really fun. And the fights were good. And then I start streaming the show to my TV through Chromecast. And again, I might be in the minority of people who watch anime on their television screens. And I had to go check to see if I had it set to 480p, because one of the decisions that was made in the production of the show at the very end was to resample and re-upload each finished episode so that everything would be extra gritty. And in doing so, made it so that it's like you have to struggle to focus on lines. And I understand that like classic anime have a particular look and feel from that's appealing to a lot of people. I mean, I've seen some old classics screened, and it's really cool. But at the same time, it's one of those things where it's like that's a product of the limitations that were there at the time, and this is essentially galaxy braining yourself into a problem that never needed to exist in the first place, because the visual flair and the character design and the background art in the music in so much of the presentation is there without this final stupid fucking step that it makes me so mad. I'm so mad at this. Why did they do this?
I think what's interesting is they tried really. I don't know what they were trying to do, but it feels like they were trying to grasp onto this idea that the aesthetic of the 90s anime was superior. Like a lot of our favorites, Evangelion and Bebop and Trigun all came from this period. And a lot of people say that anime has lost something in going digital and towards CG. The interesting thing here is I think that one, by downsampling or by going the route that they did, which seems to me like they digitally drew everything and then downsampled it to make it look 90s. They've missed the point. If they really wanted to do a tribute animation, they should have gone back and done all of, the way things were done back in the 90s and hand-drawn every frame. It's expensive. That's why nobody does it anymore. And another interesting aspect on this is a tribute show to Ashita no Joe. Season 1 of Ashita no Joe was aired in the 70s. The visual aesthetic of the 70s and the 90s is night and day. It's totally different. It looks nothing like a show from the 90s would look. Okay, well, what about season 2? Well, that was aired in the early 80s. Like, we're talking like 82, I think, is when Ashita no Joe season 2 was aired. Well, that's an early 80s show, which also looks nothing like the visual aesthetic of the 90s. So what were they doing? Why were they focused so hard on the visual aesthetic of the 90s? And trying to, like, pick up on that grunge and grit and, like, harsh lines and that aesthetic when the material that they're writing a tribute to wasn't even from that period. That's something that I just can't get my head around. Like, what were they trying to do? Why did they go with this aesthetic in the first place? If they wanted to do something old, and they were truly trying to do a tribute piece to Ashita no Joe, then why didn't they do something in the 80s aesthetic?
Or they could have done what David Production did with Captain Tsubasa and keep the same art style, but modernize it and still do it in digital, and it's still fine.
You can make that look great as long as you have like a competent animator,
And like I can understand that picking out very specific things to nitpick is a lousy way to criticize a show. But again, the critical consensus, at least from what I've seen about the show, is it looks awesome because it looks vintage, and that is, I feel like, is being used to cudgel against criticisms of the show for being lazy in its digital animation. Celeste, a scene in episode 2 that seemed to be poorly animated. I'm going to talk about real briefly a scene in episode 11 where Yuri, in a flashback, is being introduced to Shirato, and she's going to shake his hand, and he's like, "Oh, I just finished working out. I'm sweaty." And she's like, "Nah, I insist, shake my hand." And so he's supposed to go to like wipe his hand on the towel that's around his neck, and the animation just kind of shows him almost like scraping the palm against the towel, which isn't how you dry your hands. And I'm just like, oh, people are just gonna like writ large write off the mistakes the show has by just pointing to the one very specific part of the visual aesthetic and, like misread it and say everything about the show's visual design is perfect, when it's like, no, there's mistakes. There's mistakes here. And then they'll just read that criticism as a criticism of everything as a whole and be like, what, are you a fan of just digital animation? And it's, you want to throw your hands up in the air, because it sucks to argue about something that you seem to think that so many people have a misconception about exactly what you find problematic about it. So I hope that's clear. It's because we like a lot about it, but there's a lot that we'd not like.
For me, the dislikes outweigh the likes. Like, with the exception of the Araragi fight, where I was really invested, it's just kind of like, the fights aren't interesting. The choreography sucks. You can't. If a boxing anime can't get me hype, I have no time for that boxing anime.
Yeah, after
this should be the hypest shit. This should be the hypest shit.
Yeah, I know.
And it's not.
After episode 3, where Joe like knocks out that street thug in a street fight, after that point, there isn't really a point in which I can think of a memorable punch being thrown by Joe with any considerable weight. And that is criminal in a boxing anime, especially one where you're expecting some knockouts, and it just, what's more memorable is Joe getting the crap beaten out of him and standing up, which, yeah, that's cool. That's actually a pretty I'll hand it to the folks that produce the show. Like, that's actually not that bad. It avoids the show being too boilerplate, but then you wind up trading that decision for a bunch of one punch knockouts after Joe gets the crap beaten out of him. And I understand that has some degree of realism. Like, I know that's happened in fights before. I mean, most infamously, Muhammad Ali won a fight that way by rope-a-doping, essentially, and withstanding punishment and then landing enough punches to knock out his opponent. But it was more than one. It was more than one, and that's a big problem in my opinion. But yeah, let's kind of just summarize some of our general thoughts and talk about the OP and ED in a minute. But Celeste, is there anything else you want to talk about the show real quickly before we move on?
Yeah. Oh yeah, there was one other thing that I want to talk about. Why are some of the character designs so sinfully ugly? Oh, Jesus.
Which ones?
Both of the Seratos are sinfully ugly. Yuri's design is horrendous.
You really dislike Yuri's design?
I hate Yuri's design. Like, if you look at his face, like, it stood out to me in the first time when Junk Dog met Yuri, and the way his face was like framed on the shot when he's like first like staring down Junk Dog. It looks so bad. There's no detail in his hair. There's no detail in his face. There's his outfit is monotone. There's like no dynamic shading or anything, and the proportions look off, and oh Jesus, it looks awful. There's nothing memorable about it.
I actually really like his shock of white hair with the two-tone purple outfit, but I mean, like that might just be something we just fundamentally disagree about.
I like the idea of his gear.
Yeah,
that's kind of neat. I like the shot when he walks into the ring for the first time in the hoodie, and he takes it off and reveals who he is. That was a cool shot.
Yeah, because
his fundamental character design to me, with like that off red and the purple and the white hair that just kind of like traces the back of his neck perfectly. Oh Jesus, it's so ugly. And there's so many character designs that are just like forgettable or sinfully ugly.
I guess that's like maybe the one thing I disagree with you about is I actually really like the that
I loved,
aspect of the visual flair. But
I will say that Joe and Nanbu and Sachio's and the not the guy who sets up their matches, but the gangster who's doing all the intel gathering.
oh yeah, that guy in the cafe
Yeah.
often, yeah.
Those are really good character designs. You can instantly tell like everything you need to know about them from looking at those.
Yeah, I mean, I will agree that a lot of the minor villains have designs that are forgettable, like Samajima and Iglesias, who Yuri
And
fights.
then
And,
Arakawa and or is it Arakawa or
no, it's Aragaki.
Aragaki and his trainer are amazing designs.
It's so weird. It's such a mishmash of like quality and some really bad decisions in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to say that. What was the one thing I wanted to say real quickly? I will give the show credit that one of the big things that people will probably come to the show and go, wait, so he fights guys who have machine arm, like Rock'em Sock'em robot arms, with just regular punching. How does he win? And the show does take great lengths to explain that with gear, there's actually like a lag in directing your punches and whatnot. So Joe actually has like a speed advantage and something of a technique advantage because it's more or less implied that he has like a mastery of his body. He's like really trained, like get the form down, get like the purest form of boxing down against these monsters with machine arms, basically. So the show does a good job of that. And that's about it. I mean, I would say, my favorite characters in the show are Nanbu, who, he provides a lot of the narrative weight. You're absolutely right that he carries 5 and 6. I would say that there's a criticism that his character arc is a little cyclical. Like, he wavers back and forth between, like, having no faith in Joe, then having faith in Joe, then new circumstances make it so he has no faith in Joe, and then he has faith in Joe. And this happens, I think, 3 times throughout the course of the series. And it's like,
Yeah.
Yeah. And, again, I loved Yuri. I disagree with Celes about his visual design. I like everything about him, his music, his just presence, the things he says, his motivations, how his gear is fundamentally different from everybody else's in the series, because the main conceit with Yuri's gear is that it's built to function in 100% harmony with the user, unlike the other gears that are depicted in the show, which is really cool. And it's like they basically say, like, yeah, he has to be like a superhuman person in order to wield this correctly. And that's basically how they really establish that Yuri is just a phenomenal badass fighter. And that's all I got.
I'm gonna end with Megalobox by saying that when I first saw this, the premise immediately reminded me of this 2011 film Real Steel. And Real Steel was not a good movie, but I think it's better than Megalobox.
Oh god, that's awful. I would still say I scored Megalobox high enough to recommend it. Still for folks to check it out, with some strong conceits in that I really would not recommend watching this on anything but a crappy laptop screen or a really bad smartphone. So no new iPhones or anything, older phones. It's the best way to have this viewing experience in Megalobox.
I would say that the only reason you should watch Megalobox is if you dislike yourself fundamentally. or you're really into boxing and you've watched everything else, but you need another hit.
For sure. And last but not least, OP and ED thoughts. I feel like the OP is hype and the ED is forgettable. And Celes?
I hate the OP. The music for it is just so... It's like scratching nails on a chalkboard. It sounds awful.
I start headbanging to it. I like it.
It's like... You know how in grunge, grunge music is either like really good or painstakingly terrible?
Yes.
It's like terrible grunge.
I think it fits.
The animation of the OP is fine. It looks okay. It's a bunch of panning shots.
Lots of wolves.
Lots of wolves and lots of animals, but God, the music sucks. The ED is forgettable. It's legit just like a credit roll.
Yeah,
with some pretty okay music.
The music for the ED is more in line with the music that goes throughout the show. That's pretty good. I would say everybody that really enjoyed the show for the visual flair and the music should go check out Michiko Hachin, which is the series directed by it's Watanabe from Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo's understudy who did it. So it's a lot of the same people, and it has that same kind of like 90s visual aesthetic, but like maybe 3,000 people have ever watched it. And I'm just like, if y'all really want to crow about this throwback aesthetic, go watch this more obscure show that has the same kind of thing that's not marred by a galaxy brain level decision at the end. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Celeste, as we're going to do the other show we paired with Megalobox, which is Hisone to Masotan.
Hisone to Masotan is an anime about Amakaso Hisone, who is a character who essentially can't keep her thoughts to herself. She's a deadbeat character who spouts off her thoughts and repels people around her because she just can't keep her mouth shut. Since she tries hard to fit in, she is thought to be a quiet character, and since she is in the SDF, her unit doesn't want to deal with her and ships her off to the secret D program, where she is chosen by the mysterious dragon figure Masotan as Masotan's new pilot. Hisone is regularly eaten in order to pilot Masotan. As Hisone develops a bond with her dragon Masotan, she meets and develops relationships with the people around her, including the offsetting Nao-chan, the vape-smoking, kind of cool guy, but, kind of nice guy at the same time, Okanagi, and her fiery and kind of off-putting at times, but always well-meaning Kakiyasu, her flight captain. Along the way, she meets more D pilots, Hitomi Mayumi, Hoshino Eri, Kinotsugai Ririko, and a few others. And they go about learning why the D program exists and why it's important to the nation of Japan as a program and a ritual. Fro, what did you think about Hisone to Masotan?
Well, this was definitely one of the shows, along with Megalobox and another show we'll get to later on, that when it was announced for the spring season, I was the most excited to watch, just because of all the people involved in the production. In particular, it's a Studio Bones show, which, as if you've listened to our podcast or just done a rudimentary Google search on Bones, they're responsible for things like My Hero Academia, the Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood series, just a ton of brilliantly animated shows in the past. And Mari Okada, who wrote parts of Toradora, Anohana, Kiznaiver, and a ton of shows, is involved in the story composition for it. So I was definitely fucking stoked when that was all announced. I thought it was going to be a really intriguing fantasy tale that I could wrap my head around, and I was really interested to see what they were going to do with the dragons. I would say that, generally speaking, the animation of this show absolutely fucking delivered. It is a joy to watch, just everything.
This show is beautiful.
Like, it's like pretty much almost every scene is something that's been gifted on the Sakugaburu website, which is this image collecting website that collects really fluid sequences and GIFs of Japanese anime for folks to peruse and see and kind of like just assess in little pieces. It's like things like just like a character's emotional reaction to something that's just so expressive, and the show is jam-packed full of them. It's very, very gify. It's almost like it's almost like Nishijo in that respect. Mm-hmm. Basically like pretty much everything from the expressive body language, like Hisone is such a vividly expressive character with her face.
I love Hisone so much.
To the design of the dragons, to the I'll also say just the epic background work of this show is so cool too, and especially when the dragons take flight, it's just fucking beautiful. Speaking of Hisone or Amakasu, definitely a beloved character. I definitely loved her for most of the show. She's, as Celeste said, introduced a fairly novel character in that her brutal honesty and inability to keep herself from voicing the observations of others' behavior, either in conversation accidentally or under her breath accidentally, has been stifling her ability to grow up and befriend others, is a inspired take on the protagonist that has a hard time making friends trope. Basically just
wonderful.
Yeah, basically just a walking, talking, oh crap, did I say that out loud? Mess of a girl trying to figure out her place in the world amid crazy military personnel and ancient dragons. Also, she likes giving nicknames to everyone she meets, and I find that relatable because I do that all the time too. I'm gonna keep going on about the things I really loved about the show unless Saul stops me. But I want to say that Hisone and Masotan's relationship is so fucking joyous. I can't really say anything else other than watching, for example, watching Hisone just leap to start licking a century-old dragon out of affection is adorable as hell.
So cute.
Yeah, because the show does, first couple episodes of like trying to figure out Hisone trying to figure out what's the deal with everything. Like, why can I kind of get inside this dragon and start flying it, but not really fly it reliably? And after they work out the kinks of that part, which is resolved about midway through this, it's fully resolved midway through the series once we it's clear how Hisone feels about Masotan and the other dragons. Pretty much everything then on is just like, I mean, not a romance, but it's definitely like a really joyous partnership. As far as the non-main character, side characters go, I really love now the tsundere fellow D pilot who does not get her own dragon, which is infuriating to me. She's the backup D pilot who gets
none of the dragons will accept her.
Yeah, and therefore she gets sidelined mercilessly throughout the show. Her tsundere-ness, just her anger counter to Hisone's oblivious anxiety.
It's wonderful. It's
like
really good hijinks.
Oh, it's a perfect blend of characters. I really like their interactions because it's really good character-based comedy for the most part. And also, like, Hisone actually really gives a shit about now too, which is really nice. Mm-hmm. She also does not let Hisone pity her, and she has agency even within her own place in the group, which is really cool for a character like that.
Yeah.
I also really like, amongst the other D pilots, I really liked Hitomi and Liliko and their OTFs, Futomomo and Akemi. I like their designs are also really cool. But I also feel like the show barely does anything with them. Like, they're there to serve as a counterpart to Hoshino Ari's initial hostile treatment of her own OTF, Norma, and then kind of as fodder for the series' endgame. I don't know how you feel about that.
I thought it was done really well, with some exceptions. So I like Hitomi's best mom.
Yeah.
Hoshino Ari, I think, has a pretty okay character arc, although I think it ended poorly.
Yes.
Liliko, I think, is there to... I think Liliko as a character is there to, like, give you contrast for Hisone. It's a way to, like, gauge where... So let me start over. So in the series, you are introduced to this idea that the reason Now can't actually pilot a dragon is because she cares about herself too much. She has too much character agency.
Great.
It's essentially what it comes down to, right? Is like these girls, they're able to pilot the dragons because the dragons understand that these girls need something to latch onto. And as long as what they latch onto is the dragons, they will always be accepted by the dragons. As Hoshino Eri and Hisone like find their character arcs muddled in the relationships of other characters and their priorities start to shift, I think it's really important to have at least one character there to kind of serve as a continued baseline to show off how much these characters are changing. And I think Hitomi works for Hoshino. Hoshino being a kind of like character who's completely focused on her career and she wants to like break out the barrier, and she's a fierce feminist, and she wants to be a pilot. She doesn't want to be a caretaker. Liliko, on the other hand, is a character who's cool, calm, collected, and very much so keeps her thoughts to herself. She's there to kind of like reflect Hisone, in that as Hisone kind of becomes enraptured by other characters, you see, even though she's still blurting out her thoughts are changing. And it's hard to understand how those thoughts are changing without the baseline of Liliko, who doesn't change at all during the season. There's nothing to affect Liliko.
All right.
Like there is for Hisone. So I completely understand the criticism that that our favorite 2D pilots, Liliko and Hitomi, are kind of like thrown by the wayside. But I think it's important that they are, because it's important to have that baseline. Otherwise, I feel like the story I think it falls apart.
I understand that argument. I just don't necessarily agree with it. And that's largely just because I'm going to be real frank with you.
Mm-hmm.
Hoshino sucks. I want to be very clear that it's not because of her agency or drive to be treated as a No.
I dislike Hoshino too. Don't get me wrong.
And like the interest in the D pilots and the central conceit for what I want to say is episodes 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, which is they get stranded on an island on purpose to try and like engender teamwork, because they're going to have to work as a team for the end game, which is later revealed.
It's also there to like make them more dependent on their dragons.
Yeah. And the thing I just dislike about Hoshino is that her arc is a very standard boilerplate. I'm not going to accept the circumstances I've been put in a way that everybody else is telling me to accept them. I need to go my own way. And
then she completely accepts it.
Which would be fine if it continued to just be like her character with this added dimension, which it is for a couple of episodes. And then pretty much where the show, in my opinion, fucking tanks is where it dovetails into, wow, I don't think I think maybe possibly the people behind the show might have some really shitty politics. Possibly. Just gonna say that. Just because I feel like Hoshino's out there is this like emblematic of the career woman, and I feel like her character goes through the most with the least amount of payoff in the end, and I think that sucks. So it's weird in that I don't like her, but I also feel like her treatment, especially in the second half of the show, also blows. Because essentially after she's like, yeah, I'm totally fine with like treating my dragon like an actual dragon, then she's more or less sidelined when things pivot. Can we talk about let's talk about the end game of the show, because I do want to say this. For a show and maybe we'll talk about the genre conventions later, but for a show that has some particular genre conventions, one of the things I was worried about was like, wait, are they going to send these girls in to fight something? Because that's, again, you're thinking maybe they're going to go in to fight something because it's a military oriented story, and that's possible. But I actually really enjoyed the setup for or at least in reflection, I enjoyed the setup for the end game a bit more, but I really enjoyed the end game thing, the big conflict at the end, which is the performance of the Shinto ritual. Celeste, do you want to explain the ritual in itself?
Sure. So the entire conceit of the show is that the dragons guide a Shinto god through a ritual. And if this ritual is not performed properly, it will almost certainly cause a calamity upon the nation of Japan. So there's two aspects to this. First, there is the D pilots who guide the Shinto god to its resting place. And then there are the priestesses who lull the god back to sleep. The idea here is that I don't even know what the idea is.
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about this ending and like what kind of message this sends, and I have a good baseline behind it, but some of the ways that they decided to go about it are a little questionable.
No, I think that in a bare bones sense, the whole, it's like, oh, that's actually like a workable, like everything the characters went through makes sense for them to have to use their dragons to help guide this. I mean, the Shinto god is a giant fucking dragon too, is the other thing. That's crazy well animated and really cool to look at.
It's really good.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's cool, because also they find out the island that they had been stranded on is the one that was created after the dragon descended its last ritual. The big problem, and this is the thing that really killed this show for me, is that the show spends way too much of its second back half dealing with romantic subplots. There is a really, I want to say, poorly forced together romance between Hisone and Otonori Haruto, who Celeste mentioned earlier. Otonori's part in the show is kind of at first part of the initial like side character cast and crew, along with now he's essentially responsible for maintenance on Masotan and eventually all the other D pilot dragons. And he seems just like a really chill dude, and there is like some like decent like friendship camaraderie between him and Hisone. But when the conceit about the dragons and their selfishness and the inability that the pilots can have anything in their lives other than caring about the dragons, and therefore any kind of romantic relationships they engage in become problematic and they can no longer pilot their dragons. I don't know. I mean, I could say my opinions about another show that's been airing this year might be coloring my opinion of that plot, but trying to separate it and isolate that, and especially what winds up happening, which is another batch of new characters being introduced, because on top of essentially Haruto becoming a brand new character in the form of a Shinto priest that, hey, he happens to be a dragon caretaker and also a Shinto priest that's perfect for performing the ritual. Hey, on top of that, there's also a new romantic subplot with one of the shrine maiden, the Shinto shrine maidens that are flown in to help perform the ritual to put the dragon to sleep, being a childhood friend romantic interest for Haruto named Natsume, and she's a high school girl, and she sucks. She just really sucks. I'm sorry.
I dislike Haruto.
Everything with her sucks. Everything with that aspect of the romantic subplot sucks. And then all the older characters wind up gaslighting Hoshino into thinking that the one kind of smarmy military dude that's part of the same the pilot's crew, the non-D pilots but still pilots crew that helps out with the sorties that they go on.
The one that Hoshino falls in love with.
Yeah, isn't actually in love with him, and that I mean, there's really poor character resolution for that too in the final episode, and I hated everything about that because like it I think it was done in a way to try and like build some sympathy for the older generation of characters. They're trying to like just get this stupid dumbass ritual done correctly, otherwise everyone's gonna die. But instead it made me dislike them and almost go, the world's not gonna miss you people if you all die because this this ritual doesn't happen, which is a shitty thing to think, honest, I admit. But at the same time, I'm just sitting there just like, wow, this makes everybody really unlikable in a show that up to that point seemed to care more about characters being likable and trying to grow and whatnot, and that just seemed like a big step back. And like in a way where I'm like, okay, if there were other signals that this show is going to try and pivot in this route, I might be willing to go on board with this. But this just seems really, really weird and really unnecessary, and almost as if they had to call an audible in order to make things make sense, just from the sheer number of characters that get introduced in the end. I want to say this show might have maybe, out of its entire 12 episode run, there might be 2 episodes, maybe 2 or 3 episodes where there's no new characters introduced. That's insane.
I didn't think about that, but I think you're right.
That's, I mean, like, I know this is, I'm going to have a really unpopular opinion about the show because I just felt so fucking let down by it in the end. Like, it's more disappointing than the other show I'm thinking about, I'll talk about later, but another episode but of the show. But, oh man, I just, like, there are things that were handled really well up until the pivot into the second half of the show. And I'm sorry, Celeste. I really wanted to love the show, and it blew it. It blew it.
I don't think you're wrong. I'm actually like trying to think through my feelings on this show right now. Because you were talking earlier about like the romance subplots in the second half of the show, and I actually thought that Hisone and Okanagi's romance subplot was really well handled until Haruko showed up. Like, if we just ignore Haruko as a character and forget that she's there, I think that Hisone and Okanagi...
Is it Haruko or is it Natsume? Did I get that wrong?
I think it's Haruko.
So I thought Haruto was the first name for Okanagi. Are they named similarly? Is that another thing? Because I actually cannot... Because they don't list the Shrine Maiden girls' names anywhere when I was trying to find them online, so I was trying to remember. Oh, man.
Okay, well, listen, it doesn't matter. What I'm talking about, when the Shrine Maiden shows up, I'm just kind of like, I wish you weren't here. But if you just consider Hisone and, Hisone and Haruto Okanagi, I think it's a really well-handled plot. They let everything develop naturally until the Shinto, the Miko maiden show up.
Yeah.
And then things start feeling weird.
All I would say is if everyone's response to this is, how would you have gotten to the point where Hisone is having a crazy revelation that she's in love with Okanagi and then running off while sounding like a tea kettle, I would just say, oh, that's what you use now for. Like, seriously.
Yeah, that could have been it. Or even like...
Hoshino. I don't even know. Like, there's other characters.
Liliko could have done that, too. Although I think she's maybe a little oblivious. But she knew. She was, like, commenting on it, like, the entire time. Anyways, I thought that, for the most part... Hisone and Okanagi is a good, handled well. Hoshino and Fuckboy, on the other hand,
that's a good one. Yeah.
It's awful. Jesus Christ! It's just like you take everything that's initially strong about Hoshino's character and you just fucking grind it into dirt.
Yep.
In like 2 episodes, and I'm just like, man, you already had nothing going for you. And it's like, on that premise that I'm like that makes me like reevaluate my thoughts on the show, because there's a lot of other things that like kind of bother me a little bit. Like the last like 3 minutes of the show didn't need to happen. I was totally okay with Hisone's not being alive.
Yeah. I mean, I have two big problems with the last two episodes. One, for me, Hisone makes the right decision in light of all the shitty circumstances and the fact that she cannot pilot Masotan because of the arbitrary conceit that you can't fall in love and pilot a dragon at the same. Anyway, she makes the right decision, and it's like, you know, when faced with the opinion, like the information, like, well, the dragon I was arbitrarily chosen to pilot arbitrarily can't let me pilot it, and I didn't know this because the people in charge of me arbitrarily decided not to inform me this was a possibility, so I'm a quit. She made the right choice, and then the show...
It was a really dramatic moment, too. Yeah. It was really well handled.
And then the show hackneyed figures out a way to get her back in the dragon because the old lady can't hack it anymore.
That was them writing themselves into a corner. They had nowhere else to go.
Again, another moment that I would say would probably be more improved by now being inside the dragon pilot, but I understand that they had to get... God, what is her? Is it Sada? Is the name of the old lady?
Yeah, Sada.
Yeah, Sada. They had to get Sada into the dragon to give her backstory, which is tragic. And also, I mean, do you want to talk about that?
Not really. I like that they threw in Yuri, like out of nowhere.
Yeah, just one bout of Yuri in a way that it takes a couple of episodes to understand, because there's some confusion. Like I was really confused because I hadn't watched the last episode. Like, wait, if she was in love, how could she pilot the dragon? And they explain that just like Hisone, she became magically aware of her feelings, what they meant, way too late when the ritual was already going to start happening. So they're already there inside the dragon. Yeah. Oh God, let me think. What else?
It's kind of a shame because the entire show is so like wonderfully animated.
Yeah, it is.
And the soundtrack is beautiful and like. Man,
it's
talking about this show is depressing, bro.
I'm sorry. This is how I feel too. It's just something that I had really high expectations for that I think a lot of people are gonna like. I mean, everybody I ran into that went to the, I went to Anime Expo this year, and they had the U.S. debut screening for Hisone to Masotan, which is being localized as Dragon Pilot Hisone to Masotan.
Oh Jesus! Why?
And everyone that I went to, that I talked to, said it was a really cool presentation. And like, yeah, the show, it looks and is voice acted and almost everything aesthetically about it, visually, auditorily, is wonderful. They're just some severely, badly misguided, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it till we solve this problem, story and story direction ideas. I mean, some of the things they did are actually pretty novel. Again, I'm going to make it very clear that I loved guiding a giant Shinto dragon god to its next resting place as a final massive stakes conflict. I thought that was really cool and really inventive and unique. I don't think I've ever seen a show do something like that, and it made sense given the it wasn't like a power creep kind of thing where, like, you know, Hisone and the other D pilots go from like just kind of competently being able to pilot their dragons to I'm gonna fire my laser at the enemy kind of like status. It was perfectly well executed in scale, but everything about the underlying motivations and the last big emotional, like the last big conflict outside of the actual big conflict, which is the romance subplots, being such a fucking mess, just killed it for me. I mean, just totally killed it for me.
Yeah, I can see that. Man, like, it's kind of hard. There's so many things about the show that I like. I like Flight Commander Sosada. I think his character is wonderful. I liked the premise where one of the things in like episode 4 or something, they introduced the minister.
Yes.
And I Oh, I'm thinking here, oh, he's a stereotypical mustache twirling villain. Oh no, he's plotting behind the scenes. Can we not do this? And then they turned it into this really cool idea. No, we're here to solve this Shinto ritual, which our nation's prosperity depends upon. I was like, oh wow, that was a really cool way to twist this.
Yeah.
But the individual character stories are really kind of weak, which is unfortunate, considering how strong the other aspects are.
And how cool a bunch of the characters are. Which is another thing where just like...
Yeah.
Do we want to get into the end game? Before we get into the end game conversation about genre conventions concerning this show, let's just talk briefly about the music, the OP, and the ED. We both agree that pretty much everything is...
out of this park amazing.
So the show has this wonderful orchestral opening that just makes you feel like you are actually flying. And then the ED...
It's this amazing French song. It's just a bunch of character profiles.
It's like a French 60s girl vocal group. I speak French fluently, so I was like, oh, this is dope. And it actually kind of introduces the rest of the D pilots before they're formally introduced a few episodes in. But I really enjoyed all of that. And let's talk about whether or not Hisone to Masotan's a mecha or not, because I want to say, and I'm pretty sure you're going to agree with me, you're the one who fostered this idea, that yeah, it's a mecha show.
It's definitely a mecha show. First off, it's a character piece. That's the first requirement for a mecha show. Second off, the girls pilot a extraterrestrial being from the inside, which has a transforming sequence. Also,
their setup when they're inside the creatures is...
It's essentially like an Evangelion, cockpit. It's an Evangelion-like cockpit.
I mean, all of my It's a Mecha series arguments kind of are predicated on Evangelion, to be honest with you. Because it is about...
Well, the director worked on Evangelion.
Good point. Yeah, of course.
Higuchi Shinji, who worked on all of the Evangelion films.
Who the actual Shinji character's name is from. That's right, I remember that. You're correct. Yeah, so I mean, like, my thing is, like, I just kind of, like, throw down, yeah, it's a mecha show, and I just wait for other people to argue against it, and I'm just like, they're inside the dragon. If they were writing outside of the dragon, it would be strictly fantasy show. But they're inside it. There's a lot of like technical maintenance. The dragons can't actually fly without the pilots.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's a mecha. It's 100%.
It's 100% a mecha show
for sure.
For what it's worth, I will stand by the comment I made earlier, which is that Hisone to Masotan is one of the best mecha shows we've had in like 5 years. Since the last Macross.
I mean, we have to go watch that Iron Blooded Orphans Gundam series everybody liked.
Oh, well, Gundam doesn't count. I'm just like, not Gundam mecha shows.
Okay,
Hisone to Masotan is like really up there.
For sure. All right, and I think with that, this will bring us to the end of our first, or hopefully if you're watching it, if you guys are watching this or listen to it in order, the first of our sequence of 2018 spring show pairings. Celeste, do you have any final thoughts about Megalobox or Hisone to Masotan you'd like to communicate to our listeners?
I think that the moral of the story between these two shows is no matter how amazing your show, or like how visually like
striking,
yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. No matter how visually striking your show appears to be, no matter how fluid the animation is, like without a great, if you fuck up the story, you've got nothing. Because we're consuming media, and media is story.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, I mean, this is just like a case study, and Hisone to Masotan could have been amazing if they had just tightened the story a little bit.
And Megalobox could have been like an 8 if they had figured out not to blow it with the final step of the visual aspect, and then also done some better fight choreography writing and so on.
If they had done, if they had written a little bit more, emotion into the fight sequences and made me care about them like they did for the Aragaki fight.
Yep.
But they didn't, and it just feels lackluster, and it's something I don't want to spend time watching.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree.
I'd rather go rewatch Haji no Ippo or
or the original
Gurren Lagann.
Yeah, exactly. All right, folks. Well, if you're checking us out on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on Mixcloud, just keep keep that bookmarked. And again, if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, things you want to know about the show, feel free to email Celeste and I at lapsedfancast@gmail.com. We'll be back with some more on the 2018 spring season, and keep on checking out the rest of our channel for all of our other content. This is Fro signing off.
And this is Celeste.
Signing off too. Yeah.